Marrakesh came up out of the anesthetic to the sound of forceps clicking shut on something wet. And the first thing she saw, before the ceiling, before the light, before she even knew her own name again, was the thing in the surgeon's hand contracting like a struck pupil. It was small, marble-sized, grayish-pink, threaded with a darker ring near its center that looked, for one full second before her vision swam back into focus, exactly like an iris closing against the glare of the surgical lamp. "Don't move yet," the surgeon said, not looking at her, turning the object slowly under the light with an instrument that resembled tweezers built for a hand with one extra knuckle. "You are not finished waking. Your body does not know yet that the pressure is gone." Myra's mouth was dry rubber. She tried to say "what is that?" and got out a rasp instead. The surgeon set the object into a shallow steel dish and it stopped contracting, went still, the way a held breath goes still. That was the cold open of the rest of Marrakesh's life, though she would not understand that for 3 more days. The moment the thing in the dish reacted to the light exactly like an eye deciding whether it was safe to be seen. Corville Anchorage's medical bay ran on borrowed daylight, a long clear story of angled mirrors that walked real sunlight down through the station's spine from the outer hull collectors, so that even 4 decks in, the ward was lit like an operating theater at noon on a clear day, no shadows deep enough to hide a dropped instrument. It was the one deck on the station Mara had always liked. Everywhere else on Corville smelled like recycled air and hot metal. In here it smelled like antiseptic, and faintly, like the ozone tang of the light pipes themselves. She was 26 years old, a propulsion tech on the salvage tender Iron Verity, and she had collapsed 4 hours earlier in the No. 3 cargo bay with a headache so total it had felt like someone driving a spike through the bridge of her nose and out the back of her skull. Pharaoh Kwong, her bay partner, had caught her before she hit the deck plate and had not put her down again until he'd walked her, half-carried, the whole quarter-kilometer to the med bay, swearing the entire way in 3 languages. The surgeon who met them at the door was Threndel. Corville had a treaty-mandated Threndel medical liaison posted permanently on station, had for as long as Mara had been alive, which was itself a fact nobody on the dock ever thought twice about, the way nobody thought twice about the light pipes or the recycled air. Her name was Usakor. She was tall in the way all Threndel were tall, narrow-shouldered, skin the pale gray-green of lichen on old stone, with 4 long fingers on each hand, and eyes the flat amber of resin that had never quite finished hardening. She spoke through a translator collar in a voice that never once, in 11 years of treating dockworkers for burns and fractures, and 1 memorable case of vacuum frostbite, had risen or fallen with anything Mara would have called emotion. It was not rising now, 4 hours later, as she held the dish up to the light and looked at the thing inside it with an attention that had gone very still. "This is not a tumor," Usakor said. "You told me it was a tumor." Mara's voice had come back, thin and furious with the particular fury of someone who has just been sawed open under a story that turned out not to be true. "You said benign growth, pressure on the optic nerve, 40-minute procedure." "That was my working diagnosis based on the scan resolution available to me before I opened you." Usakor did not apologize, because Threndel did not apologize the way humans did, in words meant to smooth a moment over. She simply corrected the record and moved forward, which Mara had learned over the years was its own kind of honesty, blunter than sorry ever was. "The scan showed a mass. It did not show structure. I am looking at structure now." She tilted the dish. The overhead light slid across the object's wet surface, and the darker ring near its center, the part that had looked in that first swimming second like an iris, tightened again, a fraction, a flinch too small to be a coincidence twice. Pharaoh, standing by the foot of the bed with his arms crossed and his jaw set the way it got when he was trying not to be sick, made a sound low in his throat. "It's doing that on purpose." "I do not yet know what on purpose would mean for a structure like this," Usakor said, "but it is doing it in response to the light, Twice now. That is not incidental. Mara pushed herself higher against the pillows, ignoring the pull of the bandage taped along her hairline where they'd gone in behind her ear, through a channel no bigger than a stylus, guided by imaging she now understood had told them nothing true. How long was it in me? I don't know that yet either. For the first time since Mara had woken, something in Usakor's flat resin eyes shifted, not fear, nothing so readable, but the specific stillness of a mind recalculating a problem it had thought was small. I would like to run a deeper scan on the extracted tissue before I speculate. I would also like you to stay very calm while I do it, because your vitals are climbing, and you have a fresh incision behind your ear that I would prefer you did not reopen by sitting bolt upright and shouting at me. I'm not shouting. You are approaching it. Pharaoh made a sound that in a calmer hour would have been a laugh. Mara did not laugh. She was looking at the dish, at the thing that had been living inside her skull pressed up along the sheath of her optic nerve for how long, months, years, and at the ring near its center that had gone still again, waiting, the way something waits when it has just remembered it is being watched back. Do it, she said, scan it, I want to know what was in my head. Usakor carried the dish to the imaging bench without another word, and the light pipes overhead kept pouring down their borrowed, shadowless noon, and Mara lay back against the pillow with her heart going hard enough that she could feel it in the fresh stitches, and did not look away from the dish once, not even when Pharaoh finally asked, quietly, whether she wanted him to sit down. She didn't answer him. She was watching the thing in the dish the way you watch an animal you have just realized is not sleeping. The imaging bench took up the far wall of the bay, a slab of dark glass under a ring of secondary lights, Threndel built, humming at a pitch just low enough that Mara felt it more than heard it, through the frame of the bed. Usakor set the dish on the glass, adjusted 2 dials with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times, and the surface beneath the dish woke into a soft gray glow. Cross-section first, she said, mostly to herself, and the bench threw an image up onto the wall panel above it. A slice of the object rendered in false color, blues and ambers, and Mara, who had spent 6 years pulling engine cores apart down to the last gasket, and knew what a cutaway diagram was supposed to look like, felt the fresh stitches in her scalp go cold. Because the cross-section was not random tissue, it had rings. Concentric, layered, the way a tree trunk has rings, each one distinct from the one inside it, each one a slightly different density on the false color scale, and near the dead center of the thing, at the core all those rings had grown outward from, there was a small dense knot that the bench's resolution sharpened, layer by layer, into something with structure. Lens-shaped, curved. That, Pharaoh said very quietly, looks like an eye. Usakor did not answer right away. She leaned in closer to the panel, and for the first time in 11 years of watching this particular alien work, Mara saw her go completely, totally still, the stillness not of calm, but of something being recalculated from the ground up. I need to run one more pass, Usakor said finally, and her translator collar, for the first time Mara had ever heard, delivered the words a half-beat slower than her mouth moved, as if even the machine had needed a moment to catch up. I need to check the ring count against a growth rate baseline. Why, Mara said. Because if what I am looking at is what the structure suggests, Usakor said, then this did not begin growing when you started getting your headaches 6 weeks ago. It has considerably more layers than that. She ran the pass. The bench hummed its low, patient hum, and the rings on the wall panel sharpened further, and a small readout in the corner of the display began counting, layer by layer, the way a tally climbs. It stopped at 22. Marrakesh was 26 years old. She had come to Corville Anchorage as an infant. In the last chaotic month of the war her parents had died in, one of 11,000 children processed through the station's intake ward in a single brutal season, and she had grown up on this deck in this light, under the care of people who told her, when she was old enough to ask, that she'd been given every routine treatment a refugee child needed to survive the crossing. 22 rings. Usakor said the number out loud once, flatly, the way you'd read a coordinate off a chart, and then she did not say anything else for a long moment. And in the borrowed, shadowless daylight of the ward, Mara understood, with a certainty that had nothing to do with medical training and everything to do with the cold drop in her stomach, that whatever this thing was, it had not started growing 6 weeks ago. It had started growing when she was 4 years old. 4 years old put her in the second intake wave, the one that came through after the worst of the fighting, when Corville's refugee processing had briefly, chaotically, expanded to handle the overflow from 3 other stations that had lost their own facilities. Mara didn't remember any of it. Nobody remembered being 4 in the middle of a war. The mind was kind that way, or maybe just too busy staying alive to file the memory properly. What she had instead of memory was a single laminated intake card that had followed her through every foster placement and every dock apprenticeship since. A card she still kept folded into the inside pocket of her work jacket out of a habit she'd never examined. Name, estimated birth date, point of origin listed as unknown, and a column of small stamped codes for every inoculation and developmental wellness injection she'd received during processing. She had never once in 22 years wondered what was in those injections. Why would she? Everyone had the same card. Everyone had the same stamps. "I want the card," she said. Usakor looked up from the bench. "What card?" "My intake card, from processing. It's in my jacket, Pharaoh. It's in my locker at the bay, the gray one, inside pocket." Mara's hands had found the edge of the blanket and were gripping it hard enough to whiten her knuckles, and she made herself stop, made herself breathe the way you breathed when a fuel line was hissing and panic would only get you burned. "I want to know what they put in me." Pharaoh was already moving, already halfway to the door, grateful, Mara suspected, to have something to do with his hands besides stand there looking like he might be sick. "I'll get it. Don't do anything until I'm back. I'm the one lying down with stitches in my head. I'm not going anywhere." He went. The door hissed shut behind him, and the ward was quiet except for the low hum of the imaging bench and the click of Usakor adjusting the dish again, tilting it, running some third measurement Mara didn't have the vocabulary to name. "You said 22 rings," Mara said. "Is that certain, not an estimate?" "The bench does not estimate. It counts density transitions and correlates them against known Threndel tissue growth constants." Usakor set the tweezers down, and for the first time since Mara had woken, turned to look at her directly, the flat amber eyes unreadable but at least, finally, pointed the right way. "I should tell you plainly that I do not have a category for this. I have removed tumors from 6 species in 20 years of practice. I have never removed anything with a laminar growth structure and an optical lens embedded at its origin point. This is not in my training." "Then what is it in?" "I don't know yet, but there is a designation stamped into the deepest layer, the very first ring, the one that formed when you were 4, and I want to be honest with you rather than reassuring, because I think you would rather have that." She turned the display panel so Mara could see it without straining her neck, a magnified image of the object's dead center, the lens-shaped knot, and around its base, so small it had needed the bench's highest resolution to resolve it all, a series of fine incised marks. Not organic, cut or grown to a template with the mechanical regularity of a stamp. They weren't in any human alphabet, but they had the unmistakable look of a serial code, a run of glyphs, a gap, a shorter run, a gap, a final short cluster that looked, even to Mara's untrained eye, like a date. "Can you read it?" "Some of it," Usakor said, and this time there was something in the flatness of her voice that was not quite flatness anymore, something Mara would only recognize hours later as the sound of an alien choosing her words with the particular care of someone approaching a wound she suspected was her own species. "The second cluster is a facility code. I recognize the format. It is the kind of code stamped on records generated by a continuity intake station. What's a continuity intake station? Asakor didn't answer immediately. She was looking at the code, not at Mara, and the bench kept humming its low, patient hum, and somewhere down the corridor Mara could hear the distant clang of the cargo elevator, ordinary station noise, the whole world going on as if nothing in this room had just tilted sideways. It is what my government called the refugee processing you went through as a child, Asakor said finally. Corville Anchorage's intake ward was administered under a Threndel humanitarian mandate for the first 6 years of its operation. I did not serve here then. I came after. But the facility code is the same one still stenciled on the storage lockers in the old processing wing 3 decks down. The ones nobody has opened in 15 years because nobody has needed to. Mara's mouth had gone dry again, and it wasn't the anesthetic this time. You're telling me somebody put this thing in me on purpose, during processing, as a vaccine? I am telling you I don't know yet, and that I would rather find out with you than guess for you. Asakor straightened, and something in her long frame had gone taut in a way Mara had never seen in 11 years, a stillness that read less like calm now, and more like a woman standing very carefully on ground she'd just been told might not hold her weight. There is a report protocol I am required to file whenever a specimen extraction returns an unclassified biological structure with possible continuity provenance. I am obligated to file it. I want you to understand that before I do, because once I file it, people beyond this ward will know what we found in you tonight, and I do not yet know who those people will be or what they will want to do about it. File it, Mara said. Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that later, thinking back that in the moment it mattered, standing at the edge of a hole she couldn't see the bottom of, her voice had come out steady. Whatever it is, I want it on the record that it was in me. I don't want this quietly filed away in a locker nobody opens for 15 years. Asakor looked at her for a long moment, long enough that Mara wondered, absurdly, whether the surgeon was running some scan of her own, reading vitals off her face the way the bench read density off tissue. And then she inclined her narrow shoulders in the small economical nod that passed, among Threndel, for agreement freely given. Then I will file it, she said, and I will also do something I am not strictly required to do, which is tell you who to call before the report reaches anyone official. There is a man 3 decks down in the old dock quarter who worked intake registration during the years your facility code covers. He is retired now. He drinks more than is good for him, and he does not like to talk about that season of his life. But he is the only human on this station who was in that processing wing when children your age went through it. And if anyone can tell you what those injections were supposed to be, before the ministry's official answer arrives dressed up in language designed to make you feel foolish for asking, it is him. What's his name? Hesper Val, Asakor said. Tell him Usa sent you and tell him what we found. He will know exactly what you mean before you finish the sentence. I have seen him flinch at less. The door hissed open before Mara could ask what that meant, and Pharaoh came back in at a near run with the gray jacket bundled under one arm, breathing hard, the intake card already pinched between 2 fingers like he couldn't wait to be rid of it. Here, he held it out, and Mara took it with hands that were, she noticed distantly, not quite steady after all. Mara, what's going on? Usa's already filed something. I saw the light on the comm panel go amber on my way back through the corridor. That's a priority flag. That's not a routine. I know, Mara said, and unfolded the card and looked, for the first time in 22 years of carrying it in her pocket without a second thought, at the column of small stamped codes running down its edge. A dozen ordinary ones she recognized from every other refugee card on the station. And near the bottom, one code stamped slightly darker than the rest, in a font that didn't quite match the others, dated to a month 4 years into her life on Corville. She didn't know what it meant yet. But she knew, looking at it, the way you know a fault line has moved somewhere under your feet even before the tremor reaches you, that it was the same code cut into the deepest ring of the thing that had been growing behind her eye for 22 years, waiting. Hesper Vall lived in a converted cargo module on the dock quarter's lowest ring, 3 decks down and a world away from the borrowed daylight of the med bay, a stretch of corridor where the light pipes had never been run, and the fixtures were the old sodium kind, throwing everything the color of weak tea. Mara had passed his door 1,000 times in her life without knowing his name. He answered on the second knock, in an undershirt gone gray with age, a half-empty bottle of something home-distilled on the table behind him, and eyes that went, the instant she said Usacor's name, from irritated to careful in a way that told her before she'd said another word that Usa had been right about him. "You better come in," he said. His module was small and close, packed with the particular clutter of a man who had lived alone a long time, actual paper books, rare enough on a frontier station to be worth something, stacked along one wall, a single window screen showing a slow loop of some green earth valley he'd probably never see again, a workbench crowded with model ships he built, she guessed, to keep his hands busy on nights the bottle wasn't enough. He didn't offer her a chair right away. He stood by the workbench with his arms crossed, studying her face the way you'd study a photograph you'd been dreading, and when she told him what Usacor had found, the rings, the code, the intake card with its one darker stamp, something in his face came apart very slowly, like ice going soft before it cracks. 4 years old, he said. You'd have come through in the second wave, autumn intake that year. You remember me. I don't remember your face. God, no, we processed 40, 50 kids a day some weeks. I couldn't tell you one from another now if you paid me. He sat down heavily on the stool by the workbench, and one hand went, without him seeming to notice, to a half-finished model ship, turning it slowly by its bow the way another man might have worried a coin. But I remember the injections. Everybody who worked intake that year remembers the injections, whether we talk about it or not, which mostly we don't, because talking about it means admitting what we let happen under our own hands. Tell me. It was called developmental fortification. That's what the paperwork said, that's what they told us, the ones of us doing the actual processing, most of us barely out of our own war. Booster series, they said. Immune priming for children coming out of contaminated zones, standard humanitarian protocol, signed off by a Threndel medical council that outranked anybody I ever met in person. We had a quota. We had a schedule. We had 40 kids an hour some days and a room full of Threndel clinicians running the injections themselves, fast, efficient, and none of us thought to ask why the Threndel needed to run their own booster program instead of just handing us the vials and letting our own medics do it. Because why would you question people who'd shown up in the middle of a war and started saving children while everyone else was still burying them? His hand had stopped turning the model ship. He was looking at it instead of at her, and his voice, when he went on, had the flat, careful cadence of a man reciting something he had never once said aloud before. I asked once, late in the season, when I'd seen maybe 4,000 kids come through that line. I asked one of the clinicians what was actually in the booster, because the batch numbers didn't match anything in our own supply manifest, and she looked at me. I remember this clear as anything, clearer than I remember my own daughter's face some mornings now. She looked at me the way you'd look at a child asking an inconvenient question, patient, a little pitying, and she said the formulation was proprietary to Threndel continuity protocols and that my clearance did not extend to the details. Continuity, that word. I didn't think about it again for 22 years, because what was I going to do? Refused to process refugee children because a word made me uneasy. We had lines out the airlock. We had kids sleeping 4 to a bunk in the overflow bay. You don't stop and interrogate the people handing out the one thing standing between those kids and dying of something a hospital back home could have fixed in an afternoon. You knew, Mara said. Her voice came out quieter than she meant it to. Not the details. But you knew something was wrong. I knew the word made the room go cold every time it came up, Hesper Vall said. And I let it go cold and kept processing kids, because the alternative was a line of children getting sicker in a corridor while I asked questions nobody, with the answers, was going to give me. I've had 22 years to decide whether that was the right call. I still don't know. I know I think about it every year on the anniversary of the last day of that intake season. And I know I've never once told anyone what that clinician said to me, because saying it out loud makes it real in a way that just carrying it around inside my own skull never quite managed. The parallel sat between them in the small, close room for a long moment before either of them said it. The thing carried around inside a skull for 22 years, never quite acknowledged, never quite real until someone cut it open and made you look. Mara felt something in her chest that wasn't quite anger yet. It was colder than anger. It had more patience. I need you to think, she said. Not about the word, about anything else. Any detail, a name, a facility number, anything that would tell me where those Threndel clinicians came from, who they answered to, where the records went. Hesper Vall was quiet for a long moment, turning the little model ship again, slow revolutions under the sodium light. Then he stood, crossed to a battered footlocker under the window screen, and came back with a data slate so old the casing had gone yellow, the kind of hardware Mara hadn't seen running since she was a kid herself. I kept a log, he said, not because I was brave, because I was scared, and scared men keep records in case someday somebody comes asking and you need to prove you weren't the one who signed off on whatever it turns out to have been. Batch numbers, clinician rotations. The name of the facility that shipped the vials in, it's not local, it's a Threndel designation, some kind of central archive I never had clearance to look up. He held the slate out to her, and his hand, she noticed, was not quite steady. I don't know what it means. I've had 22 years and I still don't know what it means. But if there's a chance it helps you get whatever that thing was out of some other kid before it's 22 rings deep in them too, then you take it, and you make somebody with more power than me answer for it. Mara took the slate. It was heavier than it looked, or maybe that was just what it felt like to hold 22 years of a frightened man's silence in one hand. There's a boy, she said slowly, the thought arriving whole and terrible even as she said it, on the dock. Tumor rays, he's 10, his mother runs the ration counter on Bay 7. He's had headaches since spring. Everyone's been saying it's growing pains. Hesper Vall's face already gray, went a shade grayer. Get him to Usakor, he said. Tonight, don't wait for the morning shift. Why? Because the intake wave he'd have come through, if his mother processed here as a kid herself and he's 10 now. He stopped, did the arithmetic behind his eyes, and Mara watched him arrive at the same cold shape she'd already half built in her own chest. Because it isn't only your generation. If they kept running this program after the war intake officially ended, if it's still in the water, so to speak, still in whatever the standard wellness series is for kids born on this station, then it isn't a scar from 22 years ago. It's still happening. Right now. Under a different name, on a different form, and none of us have thought to ask what's actually in the needle since the day the war stopped making us desperate enough to stop asking. Mara was already moving toward the door, the old slate clutched against her chest like something that might still be warm, and behind her Hesper Vall said one more thing, quiet, almost to himself, the words of a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried alone for 22 years and finding it didn't get lighter, only shared. Tell Usa I'm sorry it took this long. Tell her I should have said something the day she first came to this station and started asking why the old processing wing was sealed. Mara didn't answer, she was already running. Tumor Rays was small for 10, quick-eyed, missing a front tooth he was inordinately proud of. And when his mother, Priya Rays, half carried him into the med bay 20 minutes later with his hand pressed to his temple and tears standing in his eyes that he was clearly furious at himself for not being able to blink back. Mara felt the cold thing in her chest stop being merely cold and become something closer to a held breath. Usakor had the boy on the imaging bench inside 2 minutes. No anesthetic, just the scanner's soft gray glow washing up over his small pinched face, while his mother gripped Mara's hand hard enough to hurt on the other side of the bed rail, because Mara was the only person in the room who could tell her, in words a mother could survive hearing, what was happening. "He's been getting headaches since spring," Priya said. "The clinic said growing pains, migraines, they gave him drops." "It's not growing pains," Mara said, as gently as she knew how, which was not very, because she had never had to be gentle about something this large before. "There's something behind it. We think it might be the same thing they found in me." On the wall panel, the cross-section resolved, and Mara watched Priya raise his face go through the same collapse hers must have gone through 4 hours earlier. The rings, the lens-shaped knot at the center, and this time, a number that stopped the whole room cold when Usakor read it off the tally. 9, Usakor said, 9 rings. "He's 10 years old," Priya said. "How can it only be 9? "Because it didn't start at 4 years old the way it did for me," Mara said slowly, working it through even as the words left her mouth, because she was an engine tech and engine techs thought in systems, in inputs and outputs, and the shape of this system was assembling itself in front of her whether she wanted to see it or not. It started at 1, maybe younger. Whatever they're calling the wellness series now, the standard newborn booster, that's when it goes in. "They stopped the war intake program 20 years ago," Priya whispered. "There hasn't been a refugee wave through this station in 15 years. Tumor was born here, on this station. In that ward." She was looking at Usakor now, and something in her voice had gone from frightened to something with an edge on it, a mother's fury finding its first foothold. "You gave him his newborn boosters yourself. I watched you do it." Usakor did not look away from her, and to her credit, Mara would think about this later, turning it over, trying to decide what it meant. She did not deflect the accusation into procedure or protocol the way Mara half expected an alien bureaucrat to. "I administered the standard newborn immunization series listed in the Corville Medical Formulary," she said. "I did not compound that formulary myself. I received it, pre-mixed, from Threndel Medical Supply, the same as every liaison surgeon on every human-adjacent station in this sector receives it. And I have never, in 11 years, had cause to question a formulary that has passed every safety audit my government has ever run on it." Her flat amber eyes moved from Priya to Mara and back, and something in them had gone, Mara realized, genuinely, unmistakably unsteady, not the careful stillness of before but something closer to a woman watching the floor of her own profession give way beneath her. "I want to be exact with you both, because I think you deserve exactness more than you deserve my discomfort. I do not know, right now in this moment, whether I have been unknowingly implanting children on the station with these structures for 11 straight years. I intend to find out, and I intend to find out before I do anything else, including sleep." She turned to the comm panel and keyed in something fast, 4-fingered hands moving with a precision that had gone brittle at the edges. And when she spoke again, her voice had the clipped cadence of someone building a wall against panic, one procedural brick at a time. "I am pulling the full formulary batch record for every newborn series I have administered on this station in 11 years. I'm also amending my priority report from a single extraction to a suspected systemic exposure event, which will change who reads it and how fast." She looked up, and for a moment the translator collar lagged behind her mouth again, the same half-beat hitch Mara had heard once already tonight, the sound, she was starting to understand, of an alien genuinely searching for words her own language hadn't given her a smooth path to. "I want you both to understand what that means." A systemic exposure report does not go to a records clerk in a locker 3 decks down. It goes to a continuity registrar, and continuity registrars do not come to hear apologies. They come to secure the specimen and control the narrative, and I have worked under enough of them to tell you plainly that the next several hours are not going to be gentle. She was right. It took the registrar 4 hours to arrive, and the moment the airlock cycled and Mara heard the particular double-cadence footsteps of a Threndel walking with an escort, she understood before she'd even seen the face that Usakor had been telling her the exact plain truth, the way she always did, whether or not it was the truth anyone wanted. Registrar Vol Amert was shorter than Usakor, broader through the shoulders in a way that read, on a Threndel frame, as deliberately built for a room where authority mattered more than speed, and he came through the med bay doors flanked by 2 junior clinicians in gray travel coats, and a floating recorder drone that Mara clocked instantly, from 6 years of dock work around surveillance gear, as a legal-grade evidentiary capture unit, not a medical one. He did not look at Toma, curled small and frightened against his mother's side. He did not look at Mara, sitting up in the second bed with her stitches and her fury. He looked at the shallow steel dish on the imaging bench, still holding the small grayish-pink object that had, over the last several hours, gone from something Usakor called an unclassified specimen to something Mara had privately, silently, started calling by a different word entirely, a word she hadn't said out loud yet because saying it felt like giving it a kind of power. A watcher. Surgeon Corps, Registrar Amert said, and his translator voice was smoother than Usakor's, more polished, the voice of a man who had given this precise kind of speech in this precise kind of room many times before. You will be relieved to know I have brought a full recovery team. This is a routine matter. The specimen will be secured. The exposure event will be assessed under proper continuity protocol, and the patients will receive whatever remediation the assessment indicates is warranted. There is no cause for the alarm your report suggested. My report did not suggest alarm, Usakor said. It suggested facts. 22 growth rings in an adult patient's extracted specimen and 9 in a minor's, both correlating to continuity intake facility codes, both patients having received newborn or early childhood formulary injections administered under my own hand at this station's medical bay. I would like the assessment you mentioned to include a full disclosure of what the formulary actually contains, because 11 years into administering it, I do not know, and I believe I am owed the knowledge of what I have been putting into the bodies of the people I am posted here to care for. Something crossed Registrar Amert's face, not quite annoyance, something colder and more practiced, the expression of a man recalibrating how much of the truth this particular room was going to require. That information is continuity classified above your clearance tier, Surgeon Corps, as I believe you already know. I am not able to disclose formulary composition in an open ward, with unshielded civilian witnesses present. Then disclose it somewhere it can be shielded, Mara said, and every head in the room turned toward her, and she found she did not care in the slightest, sitting up against the pillows with her stitches pulling and her voice steady in a way that surprised even her. Because that thing in the dish spent 22 years behind my eye, and I am not a civilian witness to my own body. I am the specimen's original owner, and I would like it back. Registrar Amert's flat amber eyes settled on her for the first time, and whatever he had expected the human in the bed to say, it plainly had not been that. You misunderstand the nature of the specimen, Registrar Amert said, and he said it the way a man says something he has said many times to many rooms, smooth with repetition, worn comfortable at the edges. It is not, in any legal or biological sense that a human framework would recognize, your property. It is Threndel continuity tissue, cultivated under ministry authority, temporarily hosted in a human substrate for developmental reasons that are, again, above your clearance to review. Its recovery is not a courtesy I am extending to you. It is a procedure I am required by my own government to complete. Cultivated, Mara repeated. In a human substrate, you're telling me I was the dirt. I am telling you the terminology is not chosen to be cruel. It is chosen to be accurate. Amherst's escort had drifted, without seeming to move with any particular urgency, into positions flanking the imaging bench, and the recorder drone's lens had swiveled, tracking Mara's face with the small mechanical patience of something that intended to catch every word she said next and hold it against her later. The tissue requires a living host substrate to mature. It does no measurable harm to that substrate during the maturation period. It is recovered at end of cycle through a minor procedure identical to the one Surgeon Corps already performed on you tonight. You have, in fact, already received the recovery. There is nothing left for you to protect. I am here for the specimen itself, and for the boy whose specimen has not yet reached recoverable maturity, and who will need to be scheduled for extraction under proper ministry supervision once it does. Priya Ray's made a sound Mara had never heard a human being make before, something between a laugh and a scream that never quite became either, and pulled Toma harder against her side. You are not scheduling anything with my son. Ma'am, I understand this is distressing. You don't understand anything, Priya said, and her voice had dropped low and flat and dangerous in a way that made even the junior clinicians shift their weight. You just told me my son has been growing something in his skull since he was a baby that you people put there on purpose, and now you're standing in my station's medical bay telling me it's scheduled. Like a shuttle departure, like a dock fee. Registrar Amherst's composure did not crack. Mara would give him that much later, turning the whole night over in her memory. But something in his stance shifted, a recalibration, the posture of a man realizing the room was not going to move at the pace his script assumed. Perhaps, he said, an explanation of purpose would ease the distress. I am permitted to disclose the general principle, even if the formulary specifics remain classified. He folded his hands, and for the first time his translator voice lost a fraction of its polish, dropped into something that sounded, unmistakably, like a man reciting a justification he had needed to believe in himself long before he ever needed to sell it to anyone else. My species suffered a catastrophe 11 generations ago that your intake records would call, imprecisely, a war, though it was something stranger and worse than that. An event our own historians still argue over the nature of, which damaged something fundamental in how Threndel minds encode lived experience. We remember facts. We remember data, sequence, procedure, with a fidelity your species would envy. We do not remember the way you remember. We do not dream the way you dream. A Threndel child today can recite the precise temperature of the room she was born in and cannot tell you what it felt like to be held in it. That capacity, the raw, textured, subjective experience of a life actually lived, was lost to my people 11 generations ago, and it has never come back. And an entire ministry exists for one purpose only, which is to recover something of it, second-hand, from species who still have it. The ward was very quiet. Even the recorder drone seemed to have gone still, its lens fixed and patient. So you grow spies in our children, Mara said. We grow archives, Amherst said, and for the first time there was something almost pleading in it, though his posture never changed, his hands never unfolded. The specimen does not merely observe. It is bonded during maturation to sensory and memory pathway tissue, and it accretes passively, without pain, without the host's awareness, a compressed record of texture, of feeling, of the actual lived weight of a life. When it is recovered and returned to the continuity archive, that record is not extracted as data for a report. It is experienced directly by Threndel archivists who have never once in their own lives felt the sun on their skin the way your species feels it, who have never dreamed, who have spent 11 generations knowing intellectually what warmth is and never once knowing it. We do not do this to harm you. We do it because it is, as far as my people have ever found, the only way left to us to feel anything real. And we have judged, rightly or wrongly. And I will grant you tonight that room is opening in me to wonder if it was wrongly, that a species with as much unclaimed, unrecorded, ordinary lived experience as yours would not miss what we borrowed. You didn't borrow it, Mara said. Her voice had gone very quiet and very hard, and in the corner of her eye she saw Pharaoh straighten off the wall he'd been leaning against, saw Usakor's four-fingered hands go still at her sides. You stole it. From children too young to say no, under a word on a form none of the people signing it were cleared to question, and you're standing here calling it a specimen recovery like it's a mining claim. That thing in the dish isn't an archive record to me. It's 22 years of my life you took without asking, and you're telling me I should be flattered you found it worth keeping. I'm not asking you to be flattered, Amert said. I am informing you that the procedure will proceed. He gestured, small and precise, to the junior clinician nearest the imaging bench, and the clinician reached for the dish. Pharaoh moved first, not fast, not violent, just his own broad body stepping sideways into the narrow gap between the clinician's reaching hand and the bench, the particular unhurried immovability of a dock worker who had spent a decade learning exactly how much space a body could occupy in a doorway during a cargo dispute. Behind him, in the corridor beyond the ward's open door, Mara heard footsteps, more than one set, coming fast, and the low murmur of dock quarter voices that had clearly already heard, through whatever channel bad news always found on a station this size, that something had gone wrong tonight in the med bay. You should know, Usakor said, and her voice, when it cut through the room, had none of its usual flatness left in it at all, that I am the treating physician of record for both patients, that neither specimen has been formally released from my custody, and that under the treaty governing this station's medical liaison post, which I have read in full, registrar, unlike, I suspect, most surgeons posted to postings this quiet. A ministry recovery team requires either patient consent or a standing continuity emergency order to compel extraction of tissue from a living, unwilling host. You have shown me neither. Registrar Amert turned to look at her, and something passed between the two Threndel that Mara couldn't read, some current of species-shared context she had no access to, and for the first time all night she saw the registrar's composure genuinely falter. Surgeon Corps, he said slowly, you understand what you are risking by obstructing a continuity ministry order. I understand, Usakor said, that I have spent 11 years believing I came to this station to heal people, and that I have just learned I may have spent that entire time also quietly harming them, and that the only thing standing between me and having to live with that permanently is finding out, right now, in front of witnesses, exactly what was done and to how many, and making certain it stops. I am not obstructing your order, Registrar. I am asking you to show me the authority behind it, in writing, in front of the patients it concerns, before one more piece of tissue leaves this ward. In the corridor the footsteps arrived. A knot of dock workers, a dozen at least, Corville coveralls and cargo-scarred hands, drawn by the same rumor current that had brought Pharaoh running 4 hours earlier, filling the doorway not with weapons, not with shouting, just with the sheer unhurried mass of people who worked the same dock every day and had decided, without needing to discuss it first, that they were not leaving. Registrar Amert looked at the doorway for a long moment, at the dock workers standing there with nothing in their hands but the plain fact of their numbers, at Pharaoh still planted beside the bench, at Usakor's flat amber stare that had not wavered, and something in his calculation visibly shifted, the recalibration of a man who had walked into a routine matter and found himself, 4 hours later, standing in the middle of an incident his own report would eventually have to account for. I will not have this station's dock population characterized in my formal record as an obstruction mob, he said, and it was, Mara understood, the sound of a retreat dressed up as a condition. I will instead request a formal continuity review hearing, convened here on station within 48 hours, with full disclosure of formulary composition to the review panel and to the affected patients under a witness record protocol. The specimens will remain in Surgeon Corps' custody, under seal, until the hearing concludes. This is not a concession. This is procedure. It's a concession, Pharaoh said, from where he still hadn't moved. You can call it procedure if it helps you sleep. Amert did not dignify that with an answer. He turned instead to the recorder drone, spoke a short clipped instruction in Threndel that the translator collar rendered only as administrative flag logged, and then, with the same double-cadence footsteps that had announced his arrival, he and his two clinicians withdrew, the drone drifting after them like a patient, unblinking afterthought. The dockworkers in the doorway didn't cheer. Nobody clapped anyone on the back. They simply stood there another moment, taking the measure of the room, and then began, one and two at a time, drifting back toward whatever shift or bunk they'd abandoned to come stand in a corridor for a woman most of them barely knew, because that was simply what you did on a station this small when word went round that something wrong was happening to one of your own. Mara didn't sleep that night. Neither, as far as she could tell, did Usakor, who spent the hours until dawn cycle running the newborn formulary batch record against 11 years of administered doses, cross-referencing every child born on Corville Anchorage against the Threndel facility codes. Hesper Vall's old data slate had finally, painstakingly, helped decode. By the time the light pipes brightened toward the station's simulated morning, she had a number, and she delivered it to Mara without softening it, because that was the only way Usakor knew how to deliver anything. 61, she said. 61 children born on this station in the last 11 years, all administered the standard newborn formulary series under my own hand, all now presumptively hosting an active specimen at some stage of maturation. You and Toma are simply the two who happen to reach the threshold that produces symptoms first. There will be others. There will be others soon, if this is not stopped before the review hearing, which will not be soon enough for at least a handful of them. Mara sat with that number for a long moment, the fresh stitches behind her ear aching in a way that had stopped being about the surgery hours ago. 61. 61 small, unknowing archives, growing quietly behind 61 pairs of eyes, waiting for a ministry somewhere to come collect a life it hadn't asked permission to record. They're going to argue at the hearing that it doesn't hurt us, she said slowly. That's the whole shape of Amert's defense, isn't it? No measurable harm to the substrate. They'll bring doctors, panel members, people who'll say the extraction is painless, the maturation is passive, that we never even felt it happening, so where's the injury? That is very likely the shape of it, yes. Then we don't argue harm. Mara was thinking out loud now, turning the shape of it the way she'd turn a bad gasket seal, looking for the seam that would actually give. Harm is something they can define away. They've had 11 generations to build a whole ministry around defining it away. We need something they can't argue with, a formulary compliance report. What would that be? Mara looked past her, at the shallow steel dish still sitting under its glass seal on the imaging bench, the small grayish-pink object inside it gone still and dormant in the daylight. No ring contracting now, nothing watching or nothing that looked like it was watching, though she had started to suspect that was exactly the trick of it, that it had never stopped, not for 22 years, not even now. You said it's not extracted as data, she said. You said the archivists experience it directly, that whatever's recorded in there isn't numbers on a page. It's what a life actually felt like from the inside, the whole ordinary texture of it. If that's true, she stopped, feeling the shape of the idea complete itself, cold and clear, the way a repair sometimes reveals itself all at once after an hour of staring at the wrong part of the engine. If that's true, then that thing in the dish isn't evidence of a crime. It's a recording of one. And they've never once, in 11 generations of doing this, had to sit in a room and actually feel what it's like to be the person they stole it from. Asakor was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her translator voice carried something Mara had never heard in it before. In 11 years of burns and fractures and one memorable case of vacuum frostbite, something that was not quite hope, because Threndel composure did not permit hope exactly, but was, perhaps, its nearest cousin. "You want to play it for them," she said, "at the hearing, in front of the review panel." "I want them to feel it," Mara said. "Not read a summary. Not hear Amherst's clinician explain the general principle in a room with unshielded civilian witnesses. I want the people who decided 61 children on the station were an acceptable archive yield to sit there and experience 22 years of an ordinary human life from the inside, the whole unremarkable weight of it, and then tell me to my face that it didn't matter that they took it without asking." "That is not how the specimen is meant to be reviewed," Asakor said. "Recovered tissue is normally processed through ministry archival channels, filtered, cataloged, distributed to trained archivists in controlled conditions over months, sometimes years. What you are describing is raw, unfiltered. I do not know what it would do to a review panel to receive 22 years of compressed human sensory memory in a single unmediated pass. I do not know that it is even physically possible to play it that way. I have never tried. No one has ever asked me to." "Can you find out," Mara said, "in 48 hours?" Asakor looked at the dish for a long moment, and then at Mara, and something in her narrow shoulders straightened in a way that looked, for the first time since Mara had known her, less like a woman following procedure and more like a woman who had just decided, quietly and completely, whose side she was actually on. "I can find out," she said. "I will need Hesper Vall's old facility documentation, and I will need you to understand before I begin that opening that specimen back up for direct interface carries real risk to the specimen's integrity as evidence, and possibly to you, since the maturation pathway ran through your own nerve tissue for 22 years, and I do not fully know what disturbing it now, outside a normal recovery, might cost you." "I already paid for it once," Mara said, "without ever agreeing to the price. I'd like a say in what it spent on this time." The 48 hours that followed did not feel like 48 hours. They felt like a week compressed down to the density of the specimen itself, ring on ring of pressure laid down too fast for Mara to fully register each one before the next arrived. Asakor worked from Hesper Vall's decoded facility documentation and from her own 11 years of formulary records, adapting a standard Threndel archival interface, a slim, cool, disc-shaped device she called a relay bridge, meant in its original design to transfer recovered specimen data into a shielded ministry archive vault under careful, filtered, months-long conditions, into something that had never been built to do what Mara was asking of it. A single raw, unmediated pass, direct from specimen to a live audience, no filter, no months, no vault. "I want to be honest about the odds," Asakor said, on the second morning, both of them hollow-eyed under the med bay's relentless borrowed daylight, the disc-shaped bridge disassembled in pieces across the imaging bench like the innards of an engine Mara had never seen the schematic for. "I do not know if this will work at all. I do not know if it works, whether the panel will experience anything coherent or simply be overwhelmed by 22 years of unfiltered sensation with no structure to organize it. And I do not know whether Registrar Amert will permit the demonstration in the first place. He has already petitioned, twice since our confrontation, to have both specimens transferred to a sealed ministry vessel pending the hearing, on the grounds that station custody presents an integrity risk." "Has the petition gone anywhere?" "Not yet. The review panel convening authority is a continuity magistrate named Selvi Oren, dispatched from the nearest regional archive 3 days ago, arriving within the hour, and until she formally assumes jurisdiction over the hearing, custody stays with me under the original treaty provision. but I would not assume Amert has stopped working. Men like him rarely stop simply because a first attempt failed. He hadn't. Mara found that out for herself late on the second evening, coming back from the dock quarter with a fresh set of clothes and a hot meal Pharaoh had more or less forced into her hands, to find a junior clinician, not one of Amert's original escort, a new face, waiting outside her berth with a data slate and a carefully rehearsed offer. A full and immediate remediation package, medical, financial, resettlement assistance to any station in the sector of her choosing, generous beyond anything a dock tech salary would ever otherwise touch, in exchange for a signed statement that she waived further review participation and accepted the specimen's routine ministry recovery as adequate resolution. She read the offer twice, standing in the corridor with the hot meal going cold in her other hand, and then she looked up at the clinician. Young, she registered now, younger than she'd first assumed, with the particular carefulness of someone new enough to the work that he hadn't yet learned to enjoy it. "Does this offer go to Tumor raised too?" she said. "Or just to me, because I'm the one old enough to sign something binding on my own?" The clinician's composure flickered, just slightly, just enough. The boy's case is being handled through a separate channel with his guardian. 61 children, Mara said. That's the number, isn't it? That's why you're standing in this corridor with a resettlement package, instead of the registrar himself standing here with another lecture about proprietary formulary. He doesn't want a hearing where 61 gets said out loud in front of a magistrate. He wants it to go away quietly, one signature at a time, starting with the loudest signature in the room. She handed the slate back unsigned. "Tell him I said no. Tell him I said it the way Hesperval should have got to say it 22 years ago, if anyone had ever thought to ask him instead of handing him a form and a quota." The clinician left without another word, and Mara stood in the corridor a moment longer, breathing hard, before she registered that her hands were shaking. Not from fear, she realized, turning the feeling over, but from something closer to the particular fury of watching someone try to buy a silence that had already cost too much to be worth any price they could offer. Toma's condition worsened on the third morning. Priya Reyes brought him back to the med bay at first light, his small face pale and pinched, complaining of a brightness at the edges of his vision that hadn't been there the day before, and Usakor's scan showed what she'd been quietly afraid of since the first tally. The boy's specimen had jumped, overnight, from 9 rings to 11, a growth rate nearly triple anything her formulary baseline predicted, as if the specimen itself had somehow registered the disturbance around it, the report, the confrontation, the coming hearing, and begun accelerating toward its own recovery on a schedule of its own choosing. "It knows," Priya said, very quietly holding her son's hand while Usakor adjusted the bench's imaging angle. "Doesn't it, somehow? It knows we're trying to take it apart in front of witnesses, and it's trying to finish before we can." "I don't know that a specimen can know anything," Usakor said, though her voice, for the first time since Mara had met her, did not sound entirely certain of the claim. "But I know its growth curve has changed in direct correlation with external events, and I do not have a mechanism to explain that which does not involve some degree of environmental responsiveness I did not believe this tissue possessed. I would like to extract it from him within the next day, regardless of what happens with the hearing, because 11 rings is close enough to a maturation threshold that I am no longer comfortable leaving it in place to test how fast 12 becomes 13. "Then extract it," Priya said. "Now, before Amert's people can argue I need to schedule it through his channel. I will need his consent as guardian on record, given how contested this specimen's status now is, and I will need Registrar Amert formally notified that a medical extraction is proceeding under my own authority as treating physician, not as a ministry recovery. It will not be simple. It will very likely draw him back here within the hour." Usakor's hands were already moving, prepping the surgical field, 4 long fingers arranging instruments with a speed Mara hadn't seen from her since the first night. But I did not become a surgeon to watch a growth curve win a race against a hearing date. Priya, sign the consent. I am taking it out of him today. Amert did come, within the hour exactly as predicted, trailing his recorder drone and a fresh objection about procedural irregularity. But Usakor was already elbow-deep in the same careful, practiced work she'd done on Mara 3 days before. And this time, Mara stood in the doorway with Pharaoh and 4 dockworkers behind her. A wall of ordinary bodies that did not need to say a word to make clear that no one was pulling Tumor rays off that table before Usakor said the boy was done. The extraction took 40 minutes. Tumor came up out of the anesthetic groggy and scared, and within the hour hungry, which his mother took, weeping, as the single best sign she'd had in 3 days. The specimen went into a second dish beside the first, 11 rings against 22, and Usakor set both under glass, side by side, in the borrowed shadowless daylight of the ward, and looked at Registrar Amert for a long moment across the bench. 61, she said. You have read my formulary audit by now. You know the number is real. I would like you to spend whatever time remains before the hearing thinking very carefully about what you are actually defending, Registrar, because I have spent 11 years believing I served a ministry that healed. I do not believe that anymore. I believe I served an archive that was willing to let 61 growth curves run unmonitored on a civilian station, because auditing them properly might have required admitting, out loud, in a report someone above your pay grade would have to read, exactly how many children this had already happened to. Amert did not answer her. He looked at the 2 dishes for a long moment, something moving behind his flat amber eyes that Mara could not read, and then he turned and left without another word, and this time his footsteps, receding down the corridor, did not have quite the same double-cadence certainty they'd carried 3 days before. Continuity Magistrate Selvi Oren arrived on the dawn of the 4th day, and she was, Mara thought the first time she saw her cross the docking bay under her own station's ordinary work lights, nothing at all like Registrar Amert. Older by whatever measure Threndel aged, her gray-green skin gone the deeper color of weathered slate, moving with the unhurried economy of someone who had spent a very long career learning not to waste a single motion on anything that wasn't necessary. She wore no escort beyond a single silent aide, carried her own case of instruments rather than letting anyone carry it for her, and when she was introduced to Mara in the corridor outside the ward, she did something Amert had not done once in 3 days. She inclined her head, slow and deliberate. The Threndel gesture Mara had learned from Usakor was reserved for acknowledging a genuine grievance rather than merely processing a complaint. Surgeon Corps' audit reached my office 2 days ago, ahead of the formal petition, Magistrate Oren said, her translator voice slower than Amert's, more deliberate, each word set down like a stone she intended to leave in place. 61 is not a number my office receives lightly. I have already begun independent verification against 3 other stations under this sector's formulary distribution. I will tell you plainly, because I believe you have earned plain telling more than most. I do not yet know how large this is. I suspect, given what I have already found in 2 days, that it is larger than 1 station. How much larger? Mara asked. I don't know yet. That is why I am here in person rather than adjudicating this by transmitted report, which is how a matter this size would ordinarily be handled from my office. Oren's flat amber eyes moved to the sealed dishes on the imaging bench, the 2 specimens sitting side by side, 22 rings and 11, dormant under the glass. Surgeon Corps has also informed me of your proposed demonstration. I want you to understand before the hearing convenes that I have never once, in a career considerably longer than Registrar Amert's, authorized an unfiltered direct interface with a review panel. It is not standard practice. It is not, as far as my own training extends, practice at all. I am permitting it today only because I have read your surgeon's technical notes, and because I have spent 2 days learning things about this program that have made me considerably less confident than I once was that standard practice was ever built with anyone's genuine welfare in mind, human or Threndel. The hearing convened at midday in Corville's largest common hall, a wide daylit space usually given over to dock assemblies and cargo auctions, its high windows throwing the same shadowless noon light down over rows of borrowed chairs that USA Corps' clear-story pipes through over the med bay 4 decks below. The panel sat at a long table at the front, Magistrate Oren at its center, 2 Threndel archivists flanking her whose names Mara never quite caught, and seated a careful distance to one side, Registrar Amert, present as the ministry's representative rather than as a judging party, his composure back in place but thinner now, worn at the edges the way a coat looks after too many hard seasons. The hall filled faster than Mara expected. Dockworkers, off-shift crews, Priya Rays with Toma tucked against her side looking pale but present, Hesper Val in a clean shirt she'd never once seen him wear, standing at the very back near the door as if he needed the option of leaving fast still available to him even now. Pharaoh sat beside her in the front row, close enough that his shoulder pressed against hers, saying nothing, which was, from Pharaoh, its own kind of vow. Word had gone round the dock quarter the way it always did on a station this size, faster than any official notice, and by the time the doors were meant to close, there were more people standing along the back wall than there were chairs to hold them. Engineers still in their work coveralls, off-duty security who'd come to stand rather than sit, an elderly couple Mara recognized from the ration counter 2 decks up who had, as far as she knew, no personal stake in any of it beyond having watched Toma grow up buying candy from their stall since he could barely see over the counter. Nobody had organized any of it. Nobody had needed to. It was simply, she understood, looking out over that crowded borrowed daylight room, what a station full of people who worked hard and watched out for each other looked like when one of their own had something worth showing up for. Magistrate Oren opened the proceedings with a summary so spare it took less than 4 minutes. The formulary, the audit, the 61, the 2 extracted specimens now entered into evidentiary record under seal. Registrar Amert, invited to respond, delivered a version of the argument he'd made in the med bay 3 days before, no measurable harm to the substrate, a ministry mandate 11 generations deep, a formulary that had passed every safety audit ever run against it, a program that had, in his framing, given something irreplaceable back to a species that could not otherwise ever hope to feel the sun the way a human felt it. He was, Mara noted, watching him from the front row, better rehearsed today than he'd been in the ward. He had had 4 days to sharpen the speech. It landed cleaner. 2 of the dockworkers behind her shifted in their seats, and she understood, with a cold clarity that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with recognizing a tactic, that a version of this room, hearing only that speech, might have found it almost reasonable. A wrong committed, yes, but committed in service of an ache large enough to make the wrong feel, if not forgivable, at least explicable. That was exactly the room Mara had built her demonstration to answer. "Magistrate," she said, standing when Oren turned to her, her voice carrying clean across the hall in a way she hadn't planned but was grateful for. "Registrar Amert has told this room twice now what his people lost 11 generations ago and what they hope to recover from children like me and like Toma Rays. I don't doubt a word of it. I think it's probably true, and I think it's probably terrible, and I am sorry for it in a way I did not expect to be sorry for anything today. But he has told you what was taken in the abstract. Numbers, principle. A general description of texture and feeling that a room full of witnesses can nod along to and still walk out unchanged. I would like to show you what was actually taken, not describe it, show it. Directly, the way his own ministry archivists would experience it, if this specimen had ever reached their hands the way it was supposed to." She looked at USA Corps, who was already moving toward the small wheeled cart she'd brought up from the med bay, The disassembled relay bridge reassembled now into something that looked, to Mara's engine tech eye, held together with more care and improvisation than confidence. "I am asking the panel's permission," Mara said, "to let this station's surgeon interface my own specimen directly to this room, not summarized, not filtered through a report, 22 years or as much of it as the bridge can carry in a single pass. I want you to feel what an ordinary human life actually weighed, from the inside, before you decide whether 61 of them were worth the archive." The hall had gone very quiet. Magistrate Oren looked at her for a long moment, then at Usakor, then at the sealed dish sitting on the cart between them, 22 rings dormant under its glass. "Surgeon Core," she said, "is this device safe to operate?" "I do not know with certainty," Usakor said. "I know it has never been used this way before. I know I have tested its structural integrity as thoroughly as 4 days permitted. I know Marrakesh has consented, fully informed of the uncertainty, and I know that I would not be standing here proposing it if I did not believe, having read her audit findings myself, and having spent 11 years watching this ministry's polish outshine its honesty, that this room deserves to feel the truth of what was done rather than merely hear it summarized by the people who did it." Oren was quiet a moment longer. Then she looked past Usakor to Registrar Amert, seated stiff and pale at the edge of the panel table. "Registrar, object now or the demonstration proceeds." Amert did not answer immediately. Mara watched something move behind his flat amber eyes, not quite fear, something closer to the specific dread of a man who has spent his whole career believing the abstraction was the kindest way to deliver an unbearable truth, and who has just been asked to watch, in front of a full hall, whether the abstraction was ever anything more than a mercy he'd extended to himself. "No objection," he said finally, so quietly the translator collar nearly lost it. "Proceed." Usakor set the relay bridge on its stand at the center of the hall, unsealed the dish, and lifted the specimen free with the same tweezers she'd used 4 days earlier, in a different room, at the start of all this. Under the common hall's high windows the daylight fell on it clean and even, no shadow deep enough to hide anything, and Mara, watching it settle into the bridge's shallow cradle, thought of the first thing she'd ever seen it do, the ring at its center contracting like a struck pupil, deciding in the half-second before her vision cleared whether it was safe to be seen. It had never gotten a say in that. Now, she thought, watching Usakor's steady four-fingered hands align the bridge's contact leads against the specimen's surface, it wouldn't get a say in this either. That, more than anything else in 4 exhausting days, felt like the exact shape of justice she wanted. "The bridge will project into a shared receptive field," Usakor said, addressing the panel, her voice pitched to carry. "Everyone within it will experience the specimen's compressed record directly, not as a recording watched from outside, but as a felt sequence, the way it was originally laid down. I cannot control which portions surface first. The bridge is not built for curated playback. It will draw from wherever the density is greatest." She looked briefly at Mara. "Are you certain?" "I've been certain since the dish went still the first night," Mara said. "Do it." The bridge woke with no dramatic flourish, no rising hum, nothing Mara's engine tech instincts had half expected. Just a soft, even light climbing off its surface, pale gold. The color of the common hall's own daylight turned inward, and then the hall was gone. Not gone the way a room goes dark. Gone the way a room goes when you stop noticing it because something inside you has become, entirely and without transition, 4 years old. She was small and it was hot, the specific damp animal heat of an overcrowded processing bay, and there was a woman's hand around hers, a hand she had no memory of in the 22 years since, but that her whole small body recognized instantly and completely, warm and calloused and shaking very slightly, and a voice above her, tired past exhaustion, saying her name, only her name, over and over, the way you say a name when it's the only thing left you're certain you still have. The line moved. Somewhere ahead, a stranger in a gray coat was calling numbers. The floor was cold through thin shoes. And underneath all of it, under the fear and the heat and the tired, repeated sound of her own name, there was the small, unremarkable miracle of a hand that had not let go, not once, all the way to the front of that line, and a whispered promise right before the needle, that it would only take a second, that it wouldn't hurt, that she was so brave, and then warm sand, years later gritty between small fingers. A laugh that wasn't hers, a boy's, some foster placement friend whose face she could no longer picture but whose laugh her whole body still knew. And the particular joy, complete and total in the way only a child's joy is complete and total, of a shell held up to the light, pearled and small and perfect. Here, look what I found. The smell of an engine bay at 14, hot metal and lubricant. An old dock foreman's hand steadying hers on a wrench half again too big, patient in a way nobody in her life had been patient with her before. Saying that's it, feel where it catches, don't force it, let the thread find its own way home, and the pure electric satisfaction, sharper than any classroom lesson had ever landed, of a bolt finally seating true. Pharaoh at 19, laughing so hard at something stupid, she'd said that he'd had to sit down on an upturned crate, wiping his eyes and the warm, unremarkable certainty, settling into her chest like ballast, that this, whatever this friendship was going to turn out to be, was going to last. 16 and furious. Standing in a foster placement's cramped kitchen shouting at a woman who was trying her best and not always managing it, and the specific bruised shame of realizing, hours later, alone, that the anger had been aimed at the wrong target entirely, and the smaller, harder thing that came after it. Walking back in, saying sorry out loud for maybe the first time in her life, and meaning it all the way through. 19, standing at an airlock viewport with her forehead against the cold glass, watching a transport she couldn't afford passage on pull away toward a placement offer on a station with real gravity and real sky, and choosing, in the end, to stay on Corville instead, for reasons she could not have explained then and only half understood now. Except that some stubborn root of her had already decided this cramped, ordinary, hard-won place was hers, whether or not it had ever chosen her back. Grief, once sharp and total, a woman she'd loved like a mother dying slow in the med bay's borrowed daylight, and the terrible ordinary detail of holding a hand gone thin and papery and finding, even then, even in the worst of it, that her thumb still knew exactly how to trace small circles against the back of it, the same gesture, unbidden, unlearned, that a stranger's hand had once used on hers in a processing line she couldn't consciously remember. And under all of it, threaded through every layer like a rib beneath skin, small ordinary moments that carried no weight at all on their own and every weight in the world laid end to end. The particular blue of the light through her berth's one narrow window at what passed for dawn on Corville, the taste of overcooked ration paste made bearable, every single time, by the person across the table, the exact, specific, unrepeatable feeling of being tired and safe at once, home, whatever home had ever meant on a station that wasn't built to have one. The hall came back all at once, gasping, gold light fading from the bridge, and Mara was on her knees though she had no memory of going down, and she was not the only one. Half the room was weeping, not politely. Not the composed, contained grief of people watching a sad report, the raw, undone weeping of people who had just been handed, whole and unfiltered, 22 years of an ordinary life they had no right to and had been given anyway, and could not now pretend they hadn't felt every unbearable, unremarkable, precious inch of it. Priya Reyes had both arms wrapped around Toma, her face buried in his hair, shaking. Pharaoh hadn't moved from his chair, but his face was wet and he wasn't wiping it, wasn't hiding it, just sitting there letting it run. Hesper Vall, at the back near the door, had both hands pressed flat over his mouth. But it was the panel table Mara made herself look at, forcing her stinging eyes up through the aftermath, because the panel table was the only place in the room the verdict actually lived. The two Threndel archivists flanking Magistrate Oren sat utterly motionless, and their flat amber eyes, which Mara had learned over 4 days to read as fundamentally unreadable, were doing something she had never once seen a Threndel face do. Not weeping. She didn't think Threndel physiology permitted weeping, not the way human bodies did it, but something adjacent to it. A stillness gone to pieces, hands gripping the table's edge with a force that had gone white at the knuckle joints. Registrar Amert had not moved from his seat at the panel's edge. He was staring at the now-dark bridge with an expression Mara had no framework to name, because she had never before seen a face built for 11 generations of careful professional composure simply stop performing it entirely. Magistrate Oren was the first to speak, and when she did, her translator voice had lost every trace of its earlier deliberate stone-setting cadence. It came out rough, uneven, a voice discovering in real time that it did not know how to deliver what it needed to say. "I have adjudicated continuity matters for 140 years, she said. I have read 10,000 archive summaries. I believed until 4 minutes ago that I understood, as well as any Threndel who has never hosted a specimen personally could understand, what those summaries represented. I did not understand. I understood facts about a texture I had never once actually touched." She looked at Mara, still on her knees at the center of the hall, and inclined her head, not the small courteous gesture from the corridor 4 days ago, but something deeper, something that looked, on that ancient slate-gray face, almost like an apology her species didn't have the exact grammar for. "You did not owe this room what you just gave it. You had already paid the price this specimen represents once, without consent, 22 years ago. You have now, by choice, paid a second price, reliving it in front of strangers to make us understand what our own program has been unable, in 11 generations of practice, to make itself understand about its own cost. I do not have words equal to that. I don't think my language has ever needed them before." "Then find some," Mara said, pushing herself up off her knees, her voice raw but steady, steadier than she had any right to feel after what had just moved through her. "Because there are 60 other children on this one station alone, and however many more your 2 days of checking found on the others, and every single one of them is going to grow up carrying a piece of themselves that isn't only theirs, the same way I did, without ever getting the chance to say no. I don't want an apology built out of words your language hasn't needed before. I want the program stopped. I want every specimen currently hosted extracted on a medical schedule that actually serves the child, not a ministry maturation window. I want every family told the truth, in plain language, about what was done, and why, starting today, not filtered through a form none of them are cleared to question. And I want it on the record, in whatever version of a courtroom your people actually keep, that what you took from us was never data. It was this, exactly this. And no formulary compliance audit was ever going to tell you that, because you never once asked the people you took it from." The hall was silent except for the sound of quiet weeping still working itself out around the edges of the room, and at the panel table, Registrar Amert finally moved, not to argue, not to object, but to stand, slowly, and turn to face Mara directly for the first time since the demonstration had begun. His composure gone entirely now, replaced by something raw and unguarded that looked, more than anything else, like a man finally seeing the exact size of the thing he'd spent his career calling routine. "I have administered or authorized," he said, and his voice broke once mid-sentence, and he pushed through it anyway, "recovery procedures on 412 specimens across 9 stations in my career. I told myself every time that the substrate felt nothing it would remember, that the archives need outweighed a cost too small to register. I did not know." He looked at the dark, spent bridge on its stand, and something in his face folded inward. "I did not let myself know. That is not the same as not knowing, and I understand now that it never was." Magistrate Oren's ruling came 4 hours later, delivered not from the panel table but standing in the middle of the hall itself, among the rows of chairs, as if she had decided a verdict this size could not properly be handed down from behind a table's safe distance. "Effective immediately," she said. "The continuity newborn formulary distributed to Corville Anchorage and to every other station under this sector's administration is suspended pending full reformulation. Every currently hosted specimen on this station and on the 2 others my 2 days of preliminary audit have already confirmed as affected will be scheduled for extraction on a medical timeline set by each station's own treating physician, not by ministry maturation windows. Every family will be given full, plain language disclosure of what was done, effective today, beginning with this station, in this hall, before this hearing formally closes. And this proceedings record, including, over Registrar Amhert's now withdrawn objection, the unfiltered demonstration this room just experienced, will be transmitted in full to the Continuity Council itself, not summarized, not filtered, exactly as we received it, because I do not believe any report I could write would carry a fraction of what that room just felt. And I am done, after 140 years. Pretending a filtered summary was ever an honest way to govern something this large. It was not, Mara would learn over the following weeks, a ruling the ministry's higher offices accepted quietly. A Continuity Council transmission arrived on station less than a day later, addressed to Magistrate Oren directly, questioning her jurisdiction to suspend a sector-wide formulary on the strength of a single station hearing, questioning the evidentiary standing of an unfiltered demonstration no prior continuity proceeding had ever admitted, questioning, in language polished smooth by however many generations of careful bureaucratic phrasing, whether a magistrate 140 years into a distinguished career had perhaps allowed an unusually affecting local incident to compromise her customary judgment. Oren's answer when it came was 3 lines long, and Usakor showed it to Mara afterward with something that was, on a Threndel face, unmistakably close to pride. "I have attached the demonstration record to this reply, unfiltered, exactly as this station's residents experienced it. I invite the council to view it before questioning my judgment further. I do not believe they will need a second invitation." They didn't. The formal council response, 3 days later, upheld Oren's ruling in full and expanded the audit mandate to the entire sector. And Registrar Amhert, in what Mara understood later was itself a small, unprecedented thing, submitted a request to remain on Corville Anchorage past his original assignment, not as ministry oversight this time, but, in his own transmitted words, as an officer of record willing to answer, personally, for as much of the recovery process as any affected family wished to ask him about, for as long as it took. Tumor recovered fastest of anyone, the particular resilience of a 10-year-old who had already decided within a week that his missing tooth and his extraction scar were both, in roughly equal measure, excellent material for impressing the other kids on his mother's dock shift. Priya Reyes stopped flinching every time Usakor's shadow crossed a doorway sometime around the 3rd week, and by the 5th, she had started bringing the surgeon an extra ration portion at shift change without being asked, which on Corville Anchorage was as close to formal reconciliation as the dock quarters language generally allowed. The other 59 children on station were extracted over the following 2 months, on schedules Usakor set herself, in the borrowed daylight of her own ward, with Priya Reyes and Hesper Val both, unasked, showing up on extraction days to sit with whichever family needed a hand to hold that wasn't a stranger's. Hesper stopped drinking most nights around the same time, not all at once, not dramatically, just a slow, steady lightening Mara noticed mostly in the fact that his hands, when he built his model ships now, had stopped shaking. Mara herself went back to the Iron Verity's engine bay 11 days after the hearing, stitches out, headache gone, the particular ordinary satisfaction of a bolt seating true waiting for her exactly where she'd left it. Pharaoh didn't say much about any of it. in the way Pharaoh generally didn't say much about anything that mattered to him. But he started walking the long way to the mess hall with her most shifts, past the med bay, past the common hall, as if some part of him needed for a while to keep confirming with his own eyes that the route was still safe. The two extracted specimens, hers, 22 rings, and Toma's, 11, remained in evidentiary seal for the duration of the sector audit. And when the formal proceeding finally closed, 3 months after the night Mara had woken to the sound of forceps clicking shut, Magistrate Oren herself came to return them, in person, rather than transmitting a routine release order the way protocol technically allowed. She came to the med bay at the start of third shift, when the light pipes had dimmed toward the station's simulated evening, and set the 2 sealed dishes on the imaging bench herself, without ceremony, the way she seemed to do most things that other officials would have made a production of. "The formal record is closed," Oren said. "Sector-wide audit confirmed 471 affected miners across 11 stations, all now on extraction schedules set by their own treating physicians. The formulary has been fully withdrawn and is under complete reformulation, this time with a human medical liaison seated on the review board by standing requirement, not courtesy. A provision I insisted on personally, and one I do not intend to let quietly lapse once the Council's attention moves elsewhere, which councils, in my long experience, eventually do." She looked at the dish holding Mara's specimen, 22 rings dormant under its glass, and something in her ancient slate-gray face was, for once, difficult even for Mara to read. "The specimen itself is legally yours now, fully released. No archive claim, no ministry interest, no further review pending. What becomes of it is entirely your decision, and I want you to know there is no wrong answer I would judge you for. Some hosts, across the sector's other affected stations, have asked that theirs be destroyed. Others have asked to keep them, unexamined, in a drawer, and never look at them again. A very small number have asked that theirs be preserved and studied, on the theory that something learned from the harm might eventually be turned toward good. I have no framework for telling any of them they chose wrong." Mara looked at the dish for a long moment, at the small grayish-pink thing that had spent 22 years growing quietly behind her eye, watching without her permission, recording a life it had never once asked to hold, and that had, in the end, become the very thing that stopped the harm from continuing. She thought about Hesper Val's shaking hands, steady now. She thought about Toma's proud, gap-toothed grin showing off his scar to the other doc kids. She thought about 140 years of careful Threndel composure coming apart in a common hall, because a room full of strangers had finally been made to feel, directly, unfiltered, exactly what an ordinary human life actually weighed. "I don't want it destroyed," she said slowly, "and I don't want it hidden in a drawer either. Both of those feel like the same thing, honestly, like pretending it never happened, just from 2 different directions." She looked up at Oren. "I want it kept somewhere it can still be seen, not studied, not archived for anybody's research, just seen, on the record. So that the next time somebody in your ministry gets tired and starts telling themselves a substrate doesn't feel what's taken from it, there's something sitting in a case somewhere that says otherwise, whether they want to look at it or not." Oren was quiet for a moment, and then she inclined her head, the deep gesture, the one that looked on that ancient face almost like a vow. "Then it will be kept exactly that way," she said. "In this station's own record hall, under your name, with a plain description of what it is and what was done to place it there. I will see to the arrangement myself before I leave, and I will make certain it does not quietly disappear into some deeper archive the moment my own attention moves elsewhere, because I intend to keep checking." She left within the hour, and Usakor walked Mara down to the record hall 2 decks over the next morning to see the small glass case that had already, overnight, been installed in an alcove near the entrance, the dish inside it, the specimen dormant and still, and beside it a plain plate engraved in both Threndel glyphs and human lettering that read simply, "Recovered from Marrakesh, host from age 4 to 26. What was taken was not data. Ask her if she is willing to tell you. Word of the hearing had, by then, traveled further than Corville Anchorage's own dock quarter. Transmissions started arriving within the first month, careful, halting messages from families on the 10 other affected stations, some grateful, some furious that it had taken this long for anyone to notice, a few simply wanting to know how Mara had found the strength to stand in a hall full of strangers and let them feel the whole of her own life laid bare. She answered what she could in her own halting way, mostly by telling the truth, which was that she hadn't felt strong at all standing in that hall. She'd felt something closer to furious and scared, and absolutely certain that furious and scared were not going to be enough on their own, and that the only weapon she'd actually had in the end was the plain, unedited truth of an ordinary life, offered without flinching. A woman from a station 3 sectors over wrote to say her own daughter, extracted at 19 rings, had asked to see the demonstration record before her own extraction, so she'd know what she was fighting to keep safe inside her own skin, and that watching it together, mother and daughter, had been the first time in the whole ordeal either of them had cried without also being afraid. Mara kept that message longer than most of the others, folded into the same jacket pocket that had once held nothing but an intake card with one darker stamped near the bottom. Registrar Amert did not leave Corville Anchorage when the formal proceeding closed, and for the first few weeks Mara found she could not decide whether that surprised her or not. He kept a small office 2 decks below the med bay, converted from what had once been unused processing storage, and he spent his days there answering in person whatever question any affected family on station wanted to ask him, not through a translator collar polished smooth by rehearsal. Mara noticed the one-time curiosity got the better of her, and she stopped in the doorway to listen, but slower now, plainer. A man who had stopped trying to make the truth sound bearable and had settled instead for simply telling it. She didn't like him. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, turning it over some nights when sleep wouldn't come easily, the old habit of the last 3 months not quite broken yet. She didn't think she was ever going to like him, not the way she'd come, against all her early instincts, to trust Usakor. But she noticed, over the weeks that followed, a specific and consistent thing. He showed up. Every extraction day, without being asked, standing quietly at the back of the ward while Usakor worked, not offering comfort nobody wanted from him, just present, a witness who had decided that being seen bearing some part of the weight was the only penance actually available to him now. She asked him about it once, near the end of the 2nd month, catching him alone in the record hall standing in front of the small glass case that held her own specimen, reading the plate beside it for what she suspected, from the particular stillness of him, was not the first time. "Why do you keep coming to the extractions?" she said. "Nobody's making you." He didn't turn around right away. "I told myself for most of my career that the substrate felt nothing, and that the archives need outweighed a cost too small to register. I have spent 3 months now learning exactly how untrue that was, over and over, one child at a time, and I find I cannot make myself look away from it anymore. I don't know if that helps anyone. I suspect, honestly, it mostly helps me, which is not a reason I'm proud of. But I would rather stand in that ward and feel the weight of what my own hands did for 11 years than go back to a ministry, post somewhere far enough away, that I could let the polish grow back over it." "That's not absolution," Mara said. "I'm not asking for absolution," Amert said, and finally turned to look at her, and there was nothing rehearsed left in his face at all, none of the smooth composure he'd worn into the ward that first night. "I don't believe I get to have that from you, or from any of the 61 families on this station, or from the 410 others my career touched before I ever came here. I am asking only to be useful in whatever small way is left to me, for as long as it takes, and to stop, finally, telling myself a comfortable story about what routine actually cost." Mara didn't answer that right away. She looked past him, at the small glass case, at the dormant gray-pink shape inside it that had once, for one unsettling second in a med bay 4 decks up, looked exactly like an iris deciding whether it was safe to be seen. "Toma's asked about you," she said finally. "Wants to know if the alien doctor who used to be scary is still around. His mother says he's decided you're not scary anymore, just sad, which apparently to a 10-year-old is a completely different category of person." Something crossed Amherst's face that might, on a human, have been the beginning of a laugh, if there had been anything in the moment light enough to fully become one. "I would rather be sad than scary. I have spent a long career being the second thing, without ever once considering it might read that way." "He wants you to come to his birthday next month," Mara said. Priya put it on the invitation list before she remembered she should probably ask you first whether you'd even want to come to a 10-year-old's birthday party on a cargo station. "I would like that very much," Amherst said quietly, and Mara believed him and found, to her own mild surprise, standing in the record hall with 3 months of grief and fury, finally starting to settle into something she could carry without it constantly cutting her hands, that she believed him without it costing her anything at all to admit. The station held a small gathering, 6 weeks after the hearing closed, that nobody quite agreed to call a memorial, because Corville Anchorage's dock quarter did not generally go in for formal ceremony, but that gathered, all the same, in the common hall on a rest shift evening, 61 families and the people who loved them, to mark the fact that every extraction was finally, fully done. Hesper Vall stood up near the end of it without being asked, his clean shirt on again, and said perhaps 11 words total, which was, everyone who knew him agreed afterward, roughly 10 more than anyone had expected. "I should have asked the question sooner," he said. "I'm asking it now." Nobody asked him what the question was. Everybody in that hall already knew. Toma gave a short, entirely unprompted speech of his own a few minutes later, climbing up onto a cargo crate someone had shoved to the front of the room for exactly that purpose, and announced to general laughter and a few fresh tears that he intended to be a surgeon himself when he grew up, specifically the kind that found things nobody else could find, and that he had already asked Usakor if she'd teach him, and that she had said yes, which he considered, he informed the room solemnly, a legally binding promise. Usakor, standing near the back with her flat amber eyes doing something that was not quite a smile but was, on a Threndel face, its closest available cousin, did not correct him. It was Usakor who found the last thing, 3 months after that, on an ordinary evening shift when Mara had stopped by the med bay mostly out of habit, the way she still did once or twice a week, to sit in the borrowed daylight and talk about nothing in particular while the surgeon closed out her charts. "I want to show you something," Usakor said, "and I want you to understand before I do that I debated for 2 days whether to tell you at all, and decided in the end that you would rather know than be protected from knowing, because I have learned that about you by now." She led Mara to the record hall, to the small glass case in its alcove, and set a handheld sensor wand against the case's outer seal, a diagnostic tool, nothing invasive, the kind of instrument she used to check environmental integrity on any preserved specimen. The wand's small display lit, and Usakor angled it so Mara could see the readout. A faint, steady pulse, slow, regular. Not the flat, dormant baseline of dead tissue, which was what Mara had assumed, without ever quite thinking to check. The specimen had settled into the moment it stopped being hers. "It's still active," Mara said slowly. "It's not maturing. It's not growing. Whatever pathway drove the ring formation stopped the moment I extracted it, and every structural scan I've run since confirms the tissue is, for all practical purposes, inert." Usakor's voice had the careful, deliberate cadence Mara had learned meant she was choosing each word with unusual weight. "But there is a residual electrochemical signature in the lens structure at its core that I did not expect to still find, 3 months on, and it took me considerably longer than I am comfortable admitting to identify what it actually is. It is a passive receiver signature. Vestigial, weak, almost certainly no longer capable of transmitting anything coherent across any real distance. But it is the same signature class, the formulary's compliance documentation lists, under a function I had never once had cause to look up in 11 years, because it was buried 9 subsections deep in an appendix nobody audits unless they already suspect something is wrong. What function? Ambient continuity relay, Usakor said. As near as I can translate it honestly, not merely a recorder that waits passively to be collected at maturity, the way Registrar Amert described it to us both that first night. A low bandwidth, constant, one-way broadcast, faint, fragmentary, almost certainly too degraded across any real distance to carry more than the barest impression of texture and feeling, nothing like the vivid, unfiltered record the bridge pulled at extraction. But present, running. The entire time the specimen was active in a host. The record hall was very quiet. Somewhere down the corridor Mara could hear the ordinary distant sound of the cargo elevator, station life going on exactly as it always had, and she stood very still in front of the small glass case and made herself finish the thought Usakor had plainly already finished for both of them. You're telling me something was getting a faint version of what I was feeling, in real time, the whole 22 years, not just at the end when they came to collect it, the whole time. I believe so, Usakor said quietly. I do not know who or what on the receiving end of that signal. I do not know whether it was a deliberate design feature the formulary's authors intended for active monitoring, or an unintended artifact of the same architecture that let the specimen accrete a full record at all. A side effect nobody bothered to examine, the way nobody bothered to examine 61 growth curves, until one of them produced headaches severe enough to force the question. I have transmitted the finding to Magistrate Oren's office. I expect it will open an entirely new line of the sector audit, one considerably larger and considerably more uncomfortable than the one that just closed. I did not want you to learn that from a council transmission summary before you heard it from me first, plainly, the way I have tried to tell you everything from the first night. Mara looked at the dormant shape behind the glass, the small grayish-pink thing that had once contracted like a struck pupil under a surgical lamp, and she thought about every ordinary moment the bridge had pulled out of her in that common hall 3 months ago, the hand around hers in the processing line, the shell held up to the light, the bolt seating true, Pharaoh laughing until he had to sit down and understood. With a chill that settled somewhere deep and did not entirely leave for the rest of that night. That some faint degraded echo of every one of those moments had very possibly already reached somewhere else, some distant Threndel archive or receiving post she would never see, in the exact instant she'd lived them, long before anyone had ever cut her open to collect the rest. She had spent 22 years being faintly, constantly perceived by something she could not name, in a life she had believed, every single day of it, belonged entirely and privately to her. Does it scare you? Usakor asked after a long silence, knowing that. Mara stood with the question for a while, turning it the way she'd once turned a bad gasket seal, looking for the give in it, and found to her own quiet surprise that the fear that should have been there, the cold crawling violation of it, the 22 years of an audience she'd never consented to and would never fully identify, had already been mostly spent these last 3 months, burned down to something steadier underneath. No, she said finally. Or, yes, a little, the way any true thing that big is a little frightening, but mostly it doesn't change anything because it can't take anything back that it already had. If something out there really was getting some faint, degraded, half-formed sense of my life this whole time, then it already has exactly what it's going to get from the 22 years it was listening. It got a hand that didn't let go in a processing line. It got a shell in the sand, and a bolt seating true and Pharaoh laughing too hard at something stupid I said. It got a woman I loved dying slow, and my own thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand without ever once being taught to. It got an ordinary life, lived as fully and as honestly as I knew how to live it, whether I knew I was being watched or not. She looked at us a core and found her own voice steadier than she expected, steadier than 3 months ago she'd have believed possible. I'm not going to spend whatever's left of my life flinching at every quiet moment wondering if something's still listening. I already decided that once, standing in that hall, when I let this whole room feel everything instead of hiding it. If anything out there was watching before, and if anything's ever watching again, I wanted to see exactly what it saw the first time. Somebody living, not somebody hiding. She meant every word of it standing there in the record hall's even evening light. And she believed, walking back to her own birth afterward, that she'd meant it all the way through. It was only later, alone, lying awake in the dark with her birth's narrow window gone black between shifts, that the steadiness she'd shown us a core thinned out a little, the way steadiness always did once there was no one left in the room to hold it up for. She found herself that first night cataloging. Not deliberately, it crept up on her the way a draft creeps into a sealed compartment, one small unnoticed gap at a time. But she lay there in the dark and found her mind sorting backward through ordinary days, wondering for each one whether it had been loud enough, clear enough, to carry across whatever degraded distance a faint signal might travel. The morning she'd cried alone over nothing in particular, 3 years ago, sitting on the edge of her bunk before a shift, for reasons she'd never told another living soul. Had that reached anywhere? Had that been felt, second-hand, by something with no dreams of its own, filed away as texture, as data, as a small strange gift it had never once had to ask permission for? She thought of every private moment she'd ever assumed was hers alone, and for one long, cold, sleepless hour, the record hall's small glass case did not feel 3 decks away at all. It felt like it was standing at the foot of her own bed. She did not tell Usakor about that night, not at first. She told Pharaoh instead, 2 days later, sitting on an upturned crate in the number 3 cargo bay during a lull between hauls, because Pharaoh had a particular gift, she'd learned over the years, for hearing a thing without needing to fix it. I keep going back through everything, she admitted, not looking at him, turning a spare coupling over and over in her hands. Every quiet moment I ever thought was just mine, wondering which ones it got, wondering if it's still, I don't know, not listening anymore. Usa says the signature's too degraded to carry anything real now, but wondering if some ghost of it is still out there, filed somewhere, in some archive I'll never see, being felt by someone who was never supposed to feel it. Pharaoh didn't answer right away. He turned the same slow, unhurried attention on the question that he turned on a stuck bolt, working it, not rushing it. "You want to know what I think," he said finally, "for whatever that's worth, which historically hasn't been much. Tell me anyway. I think you can spend the rest of your life trying to figure out exactly which moments got seen and which ones didn't, and I don't think you'll ever get a real answer, because nobody's ever going to hand you a list. Or you can decide the question doesn't actually change anything about how you live tomorrow, whichever way it comes out." He set the coupling down between them on the crate, gently, the way you'd set down something you didn't want to break. "I've known you since we were both dumb enough to think dock work sounded exciting. I've watched you cry over things you never told me about and I never asked, because it wasn't mine to ask. I don't think less of a single one of those mornings knowing something else might have caught a faint echo of it too. If anything, I think it makes them more yours, not less, because you lived them honestly, all the way through, without performing for an audience you didn't know was there. That's not something anybody, human or Threndel, gets to take away from you after the fact, no matter how far the signal carried." She sat with that a long moment, the cargo bay humming quietly around them, the same particular hot metal smell she'd grown up inside, and felt something in her chest that had been clenched tight since that sleepless night finally begin, slowly, to loosen. "When did you get wise?" she said. Same time you got brave, Pharaoh said. Watching you do the hard part first tends to rub off. She slept easier after that most nights, though the cataloging never entirely stopped. Some quiet part of her mind would always, she suspected, keep half an ear turned toward the question, the way a scar keeps a faint memory of the wound even long after the pain itself is gone. But she stopped losing sleep to it, and she stopped, gradually, checking her own reflection for signs of an audience that wasn't there. And by the time Usacor's finding worked its way through the sector's official channels, Mara had already, quietly on her own, in a cargo bay with a friend and a spare coupling, arrived at the same answer she would later give in the record hall in more polished words, that a life lived honestly could not be diminished by having once been overheard. Only a life lived in hiding could. Usacor's finding did exactly what she predicted. Magistrate Oren reopened the sector audit within the week, this time reaching backward through 11 generations of formulary revisions, rather than just the 11 years of Corville's own records, and the scope of what her office eventually confirmed dwarfed the number that had first stopped the hearing cold. The ambient relay function, it turned out, had been present in some form in every iteration of the formulary since the program's inception, a design element so deeply buried in compliance appendices that generations of ministry archivists had processed it, unread, as routine boilerplate, the same way Hesper Val had once processed 40 children an hour without ever quite letting himself ask what continuity meant. Mara followed the broader fallout the way she followed most things now, from a careful, deliberate distance, enough to know that the Continuity Council had, under Oren's continued pressure, and a second, sector-wide unfiltered demonstration Mara did not attend but heard, second-hand, had landed with the same force as the first, formally suspended the entire archive program pending a review with no fixed end date. Enough to know that Registrar Amert had been called to testify before that review in person, and had gone, and had told them, by every account that reached Corville afterward, the plain, unpolished truth of what 471 children had actually cost. She did not need to know every detail past that. She had already given the part of herself that mattered most to the truth-telling. The rest belonged, now, to people whose job it was to carry it further than one dock station's common hall. What she did read, in full, was the summary Oren's office transmitted her directly, out of the same plain courtesy the magistrate had shown from the first day, not because Mara was entitled to it, but because Oren had apparently decided, somewhere along the way, that the woman whose own life had cracked the whole program open deserved better than to learn its fate from a public bulletin months after the fact. The reformulated formulary, when it finally cleared review, ran to nearly 400 pages, most of them the dense procedural language Mara had no patience for, but the first page held the only sentence she actually needed: that no biological material of any kind could be introduced into a minor host for any purpose beyond direct, disclosed, consented medical treatment. Full stop. No appendices. No exceptions carved out for continuity. No quiet subsection 9 layers deep where a different rule might still be hiding. The old ministry archive itself, the physical one, wherever in Threndel space it actually sat, filled with however many centuries of recovered specimens processed, before anyone had thought to ask the people they were taken from, was placed under a moratorium of its own, sealed pending a review, Oren privately told her. In one of the plain, unhurried messages the two of them had settled into exchanging every few weeks. She expected to still be running long after her own 140 years were finally over. Corville Anchorage itself changed in smaller, quieter ways that took longer to notice than any council ruling. The old sealed processing wing 3 decks down, the one with the facility code stenciled on its lockers that nobody had opened in 15 years, was reopened within the year, not as a monument, and not at the dock quarter's own insistent request, torn down and forgotten either, but converted, plainly and without ceremony, into a proper station archive of its own. Real records, real names, real accounting of who had come through that intake line and what had actually been done to them. Available to anyone who wanted to look, curated by nobody but the people it belonged to. Hesper Vall took to spending most of his rest shifts down there. Mara heard, cataloging what remained of the old paper files by hand, the same patient obsessive care he gave his model ships, as if some part of him had finally found the shape of the apology his own hands had been waiting 22 years to build. What she wanted, in the months that followed, was mostly just her own ordinary life back, and she found, to her quiet relief, that it was still there waiting for her, largely unchanged by everything that had happened to her inside it. The iron Verity still needed her hands twice a week on a coolant manifold that had never once, in 6 years, stopped being temperamental. Pharaoh still made the same terrible joke every single time they cracked open the number 3 cargo bay. The one about the seal gasket that hadn't been funny the first 1,100 times either, and had somehow, through sheer repetition, become the thing she looked forward to most about her shift. The light in her berth's one narrow window still turned the particular blue it had always turned at what passed for dawn on Corville, and she found she noticed it now, actually noticed it, the way she hadn't always bothered to before 3 months of forced excavation had taught her to. She thought, sometimes, about Toma's easy public pride in his scar, the gap-toothed grin he wore it with, and tried it herself once, running one finger along the small pale line behind her own ear during a slow shift, testing whether she could hold it the same open way. It didn't come as naturally to her as it did to a 10-year-old. But she found, over the following months, that she stopped tucking her hair over the spot without thinking about it. The small unconscious flinch she developed in the first days after the surgery gradually falling away. Until one ordinary rest shift evening, she caught her own reflection in the mess hall's dented steel wall panel, and realized she'd stopped hiding it entirely, weeks ago, without ever having decided to. Priya Rays brought Toma by the Iron Verity's dock berth one afternoon in the 5th month, the boy trailing after his mother in a set of borrowed coveralls 2 sizes too big, chattering at Mara about the surgical basics Corps had already started teaching him, nerve pathways, imaging fundamentals, the correct way to hold a scalpel he was absolutely not yet allowed to actually use, with the particular breathless enthusiasm of a child who has found, in the very thing that once hurt him worst, the shape of who he wants to become. Mara let him climb up into the Verity's cockpit and press his small hands against the console the way she remembered pressing hers, at roughly his age, against a wrench half again too big, an old dock foreman's patient hand steadying her through it. "Do you think it'll always feel a little strange?" Toma asked her, unprompted, swinging his legs off the edge of the pilot's seat, his voice gone suddenly quieter, older than his 10 years for just that one sentence. Knowing something used to be watching, even after it's gone. Mara thought about that for a long moment before she answered him, because she owed him, she felt, more honesty than a quick reassurance would carry. "Maybe a little," she said. "I don't think that part ever fully goes away, and I don't think you should expect it to, or feel like something's wrong with you if some quiet nights it still crosses your mind. But I've found it matters less than I thought it would, once you stop trying to hide from it and just decide to live anyway. It's not really about the watching in the end, it's about what gets seen. And what got seen the one time it actually mattered was an ordinary life, not a secret, not a weakness, just a life lived all the way through, the good parts and the hard parts both. There's nothing in that worth being ashamed of, even if somebody was looking who never should have been." Toma considered that with the particular grave seriousness of a 10-year-old deciding whether an adult's answer had actually satisfied him, and then, apparently deciding it had, went back to chattering about nerve pathways, and Mara let him, and Priya caught her eye over the boy's head and mouthed a silent, grateful thank you that Mara waved off, because there was nothing in it, she felt, that had needed thanking. They had all simply done, each of them. The only thing left to do, once the truth was finally sitting out in the open where nobody could pretend it away again, kept going. Hesper Vall came to see her at the Iron Verity's birth on an ordinary rest shift afternoon in the 6th month. Something he had never once done in all the years she'd known his name without knowing his face. And he stood at the bottom of the boarding ramp, turning his old cap in both hands like a much younger man working up the nerve to say something he'd been rehearsing for a long time. "I brought you something," he said, and held out, not the yellow data slate this time, but a small model ship, the same careful obsessive craftsmanship she'd glimpsed on his workbench that first night. A little transport vessel, no bigger than her palm, its hull painted the exact gray-blue of the old intake wing storage lockers, the ones nobody had opened in 15 years until a frightened man had finally found the nerve to open one himself. "It's not much. It's just something I know how to make with my hands, and it felt wrong to keep saying thank you in words when I've got a whole workbench of things I actually know how to build." Mara turned the little ship over carefully, feeling the weight of the work in it, the small hand-painted seams. "You don't owe me a gift, Hesper." "I know I don't. That's exactly why I'm giving you one." He met her eyes, and there was none of the drink-loosened evasiveness she remembered from that first night in his cluttered module, just a plain steadiness that looked, she thought, like a weight finally set down after 22 years of carrying it alone. "I spent more than 2 decades telling myself I'd done the responsible thing, keeping that log quiet, keeping my head down, not making trouble for people with more power than me. I want you to know I understand now that quiet wasn't responsible. It was just easier. You did the hard thing instead, and it cost you plenty. And I don't ever want you to think I've forgotten that the only reason I finally got to say something true out loud was because you knocked on my door first and gave me the opening I should have made for myself 22 years ago. You gave me the facility code," Mara said, "the batch numbers. None of the rest of it works without what you kept." "I kept a record because I was scared," Hesper said. "You kept going because you weren't, or because you decided being scared wasn't going to be the thing that stopped you. Those aren't the same kind of brave, and I know which one actually moved anything." He settled his cap back on his head, some of the old gruffness returning to cover what had plainly cost him something to say plainly. "Toma's been round my module twice now, pestering me about the old processing wing, wants to see where it all happened for himself, if you can believe the nerve of that boy. I'm thinking of taking him down there, showing him the lockers, telling him the whole of it, the parts I've never told anyone straight through, start to finish, so it's not just a scar he doesn't understand the shape of." "I think that's exactly what he needs," Mara said. "I think it's what you need too." Hesper Vall didn't argue that. He just nodded once and turned to go, and stopped a few steps down the corridor to look back at her, the little ship still cradled in her hands. "For what it's worth," he said, "I think you'd have made a fine dock foreman yourself if the engines hadn't gotten you first. You've got the knack for it, asking the question nobody else in the room wants to be the one to ask." He left before she could think of anything to say back, and she stood there a long moment at the bottom of the ramp with the small painted ship in her palm, turning it the way he'd turned his model that first strange night, and found she understood, finally and completely, the particular comfort a man found in building something small and whole with his own 2 hands when the rest of the world had, for too long, felt entirely outside his control. The invitation to travel came in the 8th month, carried by a transit officer on a supply run rather than a formal transmission, which was itself, Mara suspected, a small deliberate courtesy, a way of letting her decide, without the weight of an official ministry seal pressing on the answer, whether she wanted any part of what was being asked of her. A Station 3 jumps out, one of the 11 the sector audit had confirmed as affected, was convening its own regional hearing, and its magistrate, a younger Threndel official Mara had never met, had asked, humbly and without any of Amherst's old polish, whether the woman whose demonstration had opened the whole sector's eyes might be willing to attend in person, not to testify again, not to relive anything in front of strangers a second time, but simply to be present in the room. While that station's own families heard the truth for the first time the way Corville's had. She almost said no. She sat with the request for 2 full days, turning it over the way she turned over any decision that mattered, and the honest center of her hesitation, when she finally admitted it to herself, was not fear of the traveling or the strangers or even the old raw ache of the memory itself. It was something smaller and more selfish than that, and harder to say out loud even alone in her own berth. She had, over 8 months, built herself a life that felt like hers again, ordinary and unremarkable and entirely private, and some tired, guarded part of her did not want to hand any more of it away, even willingly, even for a good reason, to people she had never met on a station she'd never seen. She told Usakor as much, sitting in the med bay's familiar borrowed daylight, half expecting the surgeon to talk her into going, the way she suspected anyone else in her life might have. Usakor didn't. "Then don't go," she said simply. "You already gave that hall in our own common room everything you had to give, and you did it once freely, when it mattered most, before anyone else had a framework to understand what was being asked. Nobody, not Oren, not that station's magistrate, not any family waiting 3 jumps out, has a claim on a second demonstration from you simply because the first one worked. You are not obligated to keep paying a price you have already paid in full." "Then why does it still feel like I should?" Mara said. "Because you are the kind of person who notices when somebody else is standing where you once stood," Usakor said, "and some part of you would rather be in the room for that, even at a cost to yourself, than let them stand there alone the way you very nearly did. If Pharaoh hadn't carried you 4 hours through this station's corridors, and Hesper Val hadn't finally found the nerve to open an old data slate he'd kept sealed for 22 years. That instinct is not obligation, Mara. It is simply who you are. I am not going to tell you it's wrong. I am only going to tell you that you are allowed to weigh it against everything else you are also allowed to want, and that either answer is a whole answer, not half of one." In the end she went, not because anyone convinced her she had to, but because she found, turning the decision over one last quiet night in her own narrow berth with its particular blue dawn light, that she wanted to not out of duty, but out of something closer to the plain human stubbornness that had carried her through every hard thing since the night the dish had gone still under the surgical lamp. She left Pharaoh in charge of the coolant manifold, which he complained about extensively and did not actually mind, and she made the 3-jump crossing with Usakor at her side, because the surgeon had quietly rearranged her own schedule to come without ever once framing it as anything but routine professional courtesy. The station was smaller than Corville, its dock quarter tighter, its light pipes older and dimmer, but the common hall they gathered in for the regional hearing had the same wide daylit windows, the same rows of borrowed chairs, and when Mara walked in behind that station's own young magistrate, she felt something she hadn't quite expected. Not the cold dread of reliving her own worst night, but something gentler and stranger, the specific vertigo of watching a room full of strangers arrive, one family at a time, wearing the exact same stunned, disbelieving grief she remembered wearing herself 8 months and 1 lifetime ago. She did not speak long. She had not planned to speak at all, in fact, until a woman near the front, thin, exhausted, a boy of perhaps 7 asleep against her shoulder despite the daylight and the noise, his temple marked with the same small fresh surgical dressing Mara recognized instantly, having worn its twin herself, caught her eye across the hall with an expression that was not quite a question and not quite a plea, and Mara found herself crossing the room before she'd fully decided to, and crouching down beside her, and simply saying, quietly, for that one woman and not for the recorder drone hovering somewhere behind the panel table, the only thing she had ever really needed to hear herself, 8 months ago, from anyone who'd already survived it. "It doesn't stay this heavy," she said. "I promise you that. Not because it stops mattering, it doesn't, it shouldn't, but because you find, somewhere past the worst of it, that you get to decide what the rest of the weight means. Whether it's the thing that broke you, or the thing you carried anyway, all the way through and lived a whole ordinary life around regardless. You get to choose that part. Nobody gets to take that choice, no matter what they already took. The woman didn't answer in words. She just reached out and gripped Mara's hand. Hard, the same unthinking, desperate grip Mara herself, at 4 years old, could not consciously remember giving to a stranger in a processing line and had carried in her own body every day since. And Mara held on and did not let go until the woman's breathing had steadied. And then she stood and went back to her seat beside Usakor and did not speak again for the rest of the hearing, because she had already said in one held hand everything that mattered most. They flew home 3 days later. Mara slept most of the crossing, deeper and easier than she'd expected, and woke somewhere over the last jump to find Usakor watching the dark scroll of stars through the transit pod's narrow viewport with an expression Mara had learned, over a year of knowing her, to read as close as the surgeon's face ever came to contentment. Was it worth it, Usakor asked, without turning from the window, the going? Mara thought about the woman's hand gripping hers, hard and desperate, and then, slowly, steady. She thought about the boy sleeping against his mother's shoulder despite all that daylight and noise, the same small fresh dressing at his temple that meant, whatever else was still hard about the road ahead of him, the thing itself was already out. Yes, she said, and meant it completely. A year to the day after she'd woken in the med bay to the sound of forceps clicking shut, Marrakesh found herself back in that same ward, in that same borrowed shadowless daylight, though this time she was standing rather than lying down, and this time the patient on the table was somebody else's turn entirely. A newborn girl, barely 2 days old, in for the very first round of Corville's newly reformulated wellness series. The one Usakor had helped design herself. A seat on the review board she'd fought to keep past the council's shifting attention, exactly the way Magistrate Oren had promised. Every ingredient now cross-checked against a compliance standard that had a human physician's signature on it in addition to a Threndel one. Usakor drew the injection with the same steady four-fingered precision she'd always had, and the baby cried the ordinary outraged cry of every baby who has ever gotten a needle. And her mother, a young dockhand Mara vaguely recognized from the fuel bay, no older than Mara herself, laughed through her own worried tears and said something soft and wordless the way mothers do. And it was, Mara thought, watching from the doorway, exactly as unremarkable and exactly as enormous as it should have been. A child getting a shot, nothing more, nothing hidden inside it that anyone would ever need to cut open and find, years from now, growing quietly in the dark behind an eye. That was, she'd come to understand over the year, the actual shape of the victory, not a dramatic thing, not a banner or a monument, just this. An ordinary morning where nothing secret was happening, where a mother's worry was allowed to be simple worry and nothing more, where a needle was only ever going to be a needle again. Mara lingered in the doorway a moment longer after the young mother had gathered her daughter up, watching Usakor log the routine dose into a chart that would, this time, mean exactly and only what it said it meant, and found herself thinking, unexpectedly, of the intake card still folded into the inside pocket of her work jacket, the one darker stamped near its bottom that had started all of this. She had never thrown it away. She had considered it, more than once, in the hardest weeks of that first month. But she carried it still, worn soft at its folded edges now, not as a wound she meant to keep picking at, but as a plain small reminder of the exact distance between where that stamp had once led, and where an ordinary needle led now, proof, folded flat and unremarkable in her pocket, that the distance had actually been closed, one reformed formulary line at a time, by people who had finally decided asking the question was worth more than the comfort of not asking it. She stopped by the record hall on her way back to the dock quarter, the way she still did most weeks, and stood for a while in front of the small glass case in its alcove. The specimen inside it had not changed in the year since Usacor's last diagnostic pass, dormant, inert, its faint vestigial signature logged now as a permanent footnote in a sector-wide reform record that had, by the most recent count Oren's office had shared with her, already reached back through 11 generations of formulary revisions, and forward into a fully rebuilt, fully consented archive protocol that no longer took anything from anyone who hadn't chosen, as an adult, in full knowledge to give it. Pharaoh found her there, the way he generally did these days, drawn by some instinct that had gotten very good over the last year, at knowing exactly which corridor she'd wandered down and why. He didn't say anything at first. He just came and stood beside her, shoulder against hers, looking at the small case with her. "You ever think about what it would have been like," he said eventually, "if Us's scan that first night had come back clean, if it really had just been a tumor like she thought?" Mara considered that, the way she'd learned over the year to consider most hard questions now slowly, without flinching from wherever the honest answer actually led. "I think about it sometimes," she admitted. "I think about how much simpler it would have been. 40-minute procedure, a scar nobody ever asks about, back on shift inside a week." She looked at the small, dormant shape behind the glass, the plate beside it with her own name on it, the words she'd chosen herself. What was taken was not data. "But I don't wish it, if I'm honest. Not really. Because if it had really just been a tumor, 60 other kids on this station alone would still be carrying that thing right now, growing quietly, waiting for a ministry to come collect them on a schedule nobody ever told their parents about. I got unlucky in a way that turned out, in the end, to be the only lucky thing about any of it. Somebody had to be the one it happened to first, loud enough that it couldn't be filed away quietly. I'd rather it was me, knowing what I know now, than somebody who never got the chance to do anything with it." "That's a heavy thing to carry as a silver lining," Pharaoh said quietly. "Most of the real ones are," Mara said. They stood there a while longer, the two of them, in front of the small case with its small dormant thing that had once, on the worst and strangest night of her life, contracted like a struck pupil, deciding whether it was safe to be seen. She thought about the hand in the processing line she had no memory of and every cell of her body still knew. She thought about the shell in the sand, the bolt seating true, Pharaoh's laugh from a crate he'd had to sit down on, a dying woman's hand gone thin and papery under her own steady thumb. She thought about all of it laid end to end, 22 years of an ordinary, unremarkable, entirely her own life, that something distant and gray, and starved for exactly this kind of warmth had once reached across an unimaginable gap to quietly, faintly, listen in on, and that had in the end turned out to be worth more, held up whole and undefended in a common hall full of strangers, than every careful polished justification 11 generations of an entire ministry had ever managed to build around taking it. She had spent a year deciding what she wanted anyone who ever looked into that case to understand, and she still believed, standing there with Pharaoh's shoulder warm against hers in the borrowed evening light, that she'd chosen the right words for the plate. But there was a truer, simpler version of it that she'd never quite found room to put into any official record, and she said it now, quietly, mostly to herself, watching her own faint reflection layered over the small dormant shape behind the glass. "I hope it saw something worth seeing," she said. "Whatever was listening all those years. I hope, out of everything it ever got from me without asking, the thing it remembers longest is that I lived like nobody was watching at all, and that when I finally found out somebody was, I didn't stop. I just started living loud enough that it wouldn't matter either way." Pharaoh didn't answer that. He didn't need to. He just stood there beside her a while longer, in the last of the ward's borrowed daylight, and then, because their shift started in 20 minutes and the Iron Verity's coolant manifold was never going to fix itself, he nudged her shoulder gently toward the door, and she went, without looking back at the case, because she had already given it everything it was ever going to get, And because there was, waiting for her 3 decks down, an ordinary life still entirely and defiantly her own. And for the first time in 22 years, she knew exactly who had seen it, and exactly what they'd found.